All right, so picking up again with Kant's Prolegomena for any future metaphysics. We left off talking about the difference between analytic and synthetic a priori judgments, and more specifically with the idea that synthetic a priori judgments are possible because they're based in pure a priori intuition of space and time, right? That those synthetic a priori judgments uh, are, as Kant says, demonstrated, or more accurately, constructed, he says, in this intuition. So we saw um, the way that 2 plus 2 equals 4 can be arrived at without reference to the empirical world, solely in reflection, right? In a priori reason, by counting units on a timeline, right? T1, T2, T3, and 4, add them together. We can refer only to our internal sense of time in order to construct, right, this equation, 2 plus 2 equals 4. So Kant gives a couple other examples of this, right, to show the way that mathematics can be a priori. It doesn't require reference to the external world, but can be constructed with reference only to pure intuition. And this idea of construction is, that word construction is the word that he uses to talk about this. So we think also of geometry, right? So if arithmetic is based on time units, which are internal, having to do only with our minds, the same thing is true about geometry, right? That we have the capacity to not only draw a line in our mind's eye, so to speak, but also to construct geometric figures, and even then to analyze those figures, all within our mind, without reference to the external world, so that in my mind's eye, I can draw a right triangle, and I can analyze it to figure out, the angles, right? What the value of the angles is. Now that kind of construction of a triangle in your mind's eye, Kant thinks, is again possible without ever having any reference to an actual existing empirical triangle. That all of that geometrical thinking can happen a priori. Now, right, and it happens a priori with reference only to the intuition of pure space, like that pure space of the mind's eye in which we can draw a triangle, in which we can imagine things. So space and time are available in our thinking, to our minds, independently of any empirical experience. Now, this fact, right, or this observation, has enormous implications. The first of which, or really the central one, is that space and time, being the form of sensibility, are not things that exist in the external world, but are instead products of our own thinking. Now, this is a wild idea because, right? What Kant is suggesting, what he's saying, uh, that is that we can't know if space and time are in fact in any way part of the world that exists independently of our experience of it. Because space and time are conditions for the possibility of experience and primarily exist as functions of our own thinking, right? Or rather, our only experience of them is as a product of our own thinking. This means that we can't know uh, if space and time actually exist in the external world. That therefore, all of our representations of the external world, and we can remember our Descartes here, and for that matter also Spinoza and Hume, and all of whom believe ideas are representations of external objects. What thinking is creating representations of the external world, and true ideas are those ideas which are representations that accurately correspond to reality. So, right, truth in modern philosophy means correspondence between idea and thing. And an idea is a representation of that thing. So truth is accuracy of representation of an external object. And you would test the accuracy of that representation and correspondence by investigating empirical objects. Well, what Kant is saying here is that we can have no actual knowledge of the correspondence between our representation of an object and the object itself. We can never have access to the thing itself at all. And this is, most made clearest by this observation that space and time are part of the representation, not part of the thing represented. Right? Space and time are forms of representation. So when we have an idea of a thing, that thing is represented to us within space and time. We represent it to ourselves as existing within space and time. But that representation cannot be checked against anything else. In order to test that representation, our ideas, we would have to have access to the thing in itself, meaning the thing that exists outside of our representation of it. So, by pointing out that space and time are parts of our way of representing objects to ourselves, what Kant is saying is that anything that appears within space and time is a representation. And therefore, all of the objects in the world that we experience are also, in some sense, representations. So all we have is representation. And we can never have access to the thing in itself that would allow us to test the accuracy of our representations. For us to have access to a thing in itself would mean having access to it outside of space and time, which are products of our own manner of representation. So because there are, according to Kant, these conditions for the possibility of experience, space and time, the intuitions of space and time, as well as a priori pure concepts, which we'll get to in a moment. Because there are these conditions of possibility for experience, we can't ever have access to unconditional reality. Reality as exists in itself. All we can have access to, and all we ever encounter in the empirical world, are representations, or what Kant calls appearances. The world as it appears to us, right? In the manner that it's able to appear to us. That manner which is conditioned by the intuitions of space and time, the forms of our sensibility. This is the distinction between phenomena and noumena, right? Which we mentioned in class. The phenomenal realm, the realm of phenomena, is the realm of appearance, right? The world as it appears to us. And it is the only world that we can ever have access to. The world of noumena is the world of things as they exist in themselves, the realm, as Kant says, of things in themselves. And this world is closed to us. We can never have any knowledge of it, right? Because how would we get knowledge of it? In order to have knowledge of it, we would have to encounter it, have some experience of it. But in order to have an experience of it, that experience has to pass through the form of our sensibility and meet the conditions for the possibility of experience, and thereby no longer become something other than a thing in itself and become a thing that appears to us. To have knowledge of things in themselves would be to have knowledge, would be to have a kind of omniscient knowledge, right? A God's eye perspective. Only God could ever know things in themselves. So this whole concept, then, of representation, of truth as correspondence to an actual existing world, correspondence to things as they are in themselves, independently of our opinions. That whole concept of truth for Kant has to be thrown out, right? Because there isn't a distinction we can make between representations and things in themselves, real things that we encounter and experience. Everything is representation. Now, a couple of points here. First of all, doesn't this lead to the idea then that there's no such thing as reality, or that there's no difference between reality and a dream, that reality is just a fantasy? Okay, so that would be one question. And the second related question would be, if this is true, that everything is representation, that everything is conditional, and we never have access to things in themselves, how can we have scientific knowledge? That is to say, it seems that science certainly explains things in themselves. Right? Uh, Scientific knowledge based on observation is able to make predictions about how things will uh, move, how things will behave. Right? This is what the scientific method is, right? I make a prediction, and if my prediction comes true, then I understand the mechanism, the law that caused that thing to happen. Science, moreover, does explain and describe, at least describe, uh, what appear to be universal laws of nature that are not our invention, that are not, under our control in any way, and which seem to certainly exist independently of us. Do we really believe that, for example, gravity is merely a product of our own a priori ideas or our own intuitions and form of sensibility? Isn't it true that even outside of our experience, things fall to the earth, fall to the earth? Doesn't it seem that the world that we experience is also the world that other animals experience, right? That a bat or a dog experiences, albeit through a different form of sensibility. And even that the world we experience is a set world that acts on inanimate objects in a defined way. Right? That science describes a real world with real rules, laws of physics that can't possibly be the product of our own imagination. So, how can we have science? And what does science mean in Kant's view? So, to the first point, that this turns the world into fantasy, Kant writes, uh, from this it follows not at all that the propositions of geometry are determinations of a mere figment of our poetic fantasy, and therefore could not, with certainty, be referred to actual objects, but rather that they are valid necessarily for space, and consequently for everything that may be found in space, because space is nothing other than the form of all outer appearances. Okay, so what Kant is doing here, the distinction that he's making, is that just because reality, appearances, right, just because the world of experience is determined by something a priori, something non-empirical, doesn't mean that that which determines experience is arbitrary or a product of imagination, product of fantasy. In other words, that that which conditions experience is unreal. The conditions for the possibility of experience and the form of sensibility are not illusory. They aren't false. They don't falsify the world or turn the world into fantasy, but rather they structure and give a certain kind of order to the world. And that what counts as true and valid corresponds not to things in themselves, but to the idea of space itself, right? The order of space, right? The sort of laws of spatiality. We don't create the idea of space and then imagine that everything is in space, but rather, right, space is a condition that is imposed not simply by us on the external world, but also imposed on us as experiencing beings. So that when we are testing something, right, when we are testing the truth of our representations, of our ideas, we are testing those ideas against the form of space, the form of time, right? So the fact that we're able to access space a priori, away from experience, and draw a triangle and right determine the angles of that triangle within this abstract intellectual space doesn't mean that all of that is uh, arbitrary or illusory or imaginary. It means that we are endowed with an understanding of certain conditions and laws whereby the world becomes intelligible, cognizable, and experiential for us. When we are drawing a triangle in our mind's eye, we are still governed by certain laws of space. Right? For example, we can't make a right triangle's angles add up to more than 180 degrees. That is a condition and a law that does not issue from the external world itself, but is a law that issues from spatiality itself, the nature of space, the nature of the form of sensibility that allows us to experience anything. Right? And the same would be true of time. Right? We've thought about this in a few times, right? That we conceive time as succession. We can imagine that time might be something other than succession. Right? We can imagine, although we would never be able to experience this or even truly understand it, but we can imagine and we can speculate it might be possible that time would move differently than as succession, as a series of events, a series of moments. Time would be something other than linear, unidirectional. We could imagine with Spinoza, right, the essential non-existence of time, or that time might be able to move backwards and forwards, or that time in its eternality is, multidirectional. However, and this would be Kant's point, we are incapable of actually having an experience or of reflecting, of thinking in any other way except in linear successive time. And so we can think perhaps in that noumenal realm, we might imagine that time is something other than it is for us. But for us, in our particular form of sensibility, time is succession, time is linear. Right? Time structures things according to a certain order and law, the law of succession. So, the fact that we don't have interaction with things in themselves, but only as they appear to us, doesn't mean that that our experience is imaginary or false. He writes a little below that these objects are surely not representations of things as they are in themselves, and as the pure understanding would cognize them. Rather, they are sensory intuitions, i.e., appearances whose possibility rests on the relation of certain things, unknown in themselves, to something else, namely our sensibility. So, the validity and truth of our ideas is not sort of up to us to determine, not arbitrary. And the fact that it's not based in things in themselves doesn't mean that it isn't certain and right able to give us that clear and distinct knowledge that Descartes mentions. So he says, though they're not representations of things in themselves, right, they are sensory intuitions whose possibility rests on the relation of certain things, unknown in themselves, to something else, namely our sensibility. So that what fixes the idea of truth, what fixes validity and reality, is the way that those noumenal beings, those beings that we don't have access to, things in themselves, are taken up by, relate to our own sensibility. So that while we don't know what a thing actually is in itself, we can know what a thing is as it really appears to us. Right? That is the best we can do. And the way things really appear to us is governed by certain universal necessary laws, which are going to be absolute, understandable, valid, and above all, universal. Right? So, a little bit below this, Kant elaborates a little bit more. The difference between truth and dream is not decided through the quality of the representations that are referred to objects. Right? It's not that our representations are more accurate with respect to things in themselves in waking life, and dreams are false because they aren't referred to any real object in itself. For they are the same in both. Right? So dreams and reality have no direct access to anything in itself. He says, the difference between truth and dream is decided through their connection according to the rules that determine the connection of representations in the concept of the object. Okay, so through their connection, according to the rules that determine the connection of representations. Now, what is he getting at here? That all appearances follow the same set of rules, insofar as all things in themselves must be conditioned by the same form of sensibility. And therefore, right, what makes reality reality is, or how we can know reality from dream, from illusion, is that all of the connections in an experience abide by the same set of uh, rules of sensibility. So in a dream, when um, you are experiencing something as though it's reality, and then suddenly you are in a completely different environment, um, dealing with a whole different set of objects. Uh, no particular object in a dream is false, right? Uh, the representation of any object in the dream is valid, right? When I see an image of a tree in a dream, that representation is not any more or less real than the representation I have of a tree when I'm actually seeing it in the flesh. Uh, Reality is not determined by the vivacity of the impression, right, as Hume has it. Reality is determined instead by the consistency and coherence of all of these experiences in relation to one another, right? So that obviously, what cues me into the fact that the dream is not reality is that abrupt change of scene, right? Where the consistency of the relations between things is interrupted, where suddenly the form of sensibility uh, is interrupted. Right? That's how we know that we aren't dealing with reality, because in reality, all things must abide by the same form of sensibility. Um, and so it would be impossible to have this abrupt shift in reality where one moment I'm in New York and the next moment I'm in California, right? We know that that doesn't conform to the right the intuition of time or space, right? Where we have to have a succession uh, of of events, a movement from New York to California, um, so that reality is based again, and I think this is somewhat indebted to Hume, entirely on the connections among things, right? That they all follow the same rules. And there's no interruption in those rules. So this brings us to the next, what Kant calls the main transcendental problem, second part. The main transcendental problem, first part, concerns mathematics, right? And a priori, synthetic judgments dealing with mathematics. The second part deals with a priori, uh, synthetic judgments dealing with the natural sciences. And here, Kant is developing this idea about um, the consistency uh, of our experience of reality. That reality lies in the consistency of representation. That all things take on the same form of sensibility. How can there be science if everything is based in intuition and a priori non-empirical ideas? Science is about empiricism, is about the experiential world. So how can there be this kind of truth in science? And the key here is to now make a distinction between sensibility and intuition on the one hand, sensibility generally, right, which includes the form of sensibility, which is the intuitions of space and time, and the content of sensibility, which are the actual sense data we get through our senses. So that is one part of what Kant calls cognition, understanding of reality. I'm sorry, our grasp of reality. Uh, and the other part of cognition, grasping reality, won't be sensibility, but the understanding. Right? The understanding is what allows us to sort of evaluate the consistency of these representations we have of the phenomenal world, the realm of appearances. The understanding is about the empirical world. It is distinguished from pure logic or pure reason by Kant, because pure logic and pure reason can be, or right, generally are, non-empirical. Right? We can do pure logic without ever having any reference to the external world, and pure logic is, largely analytical in some sense. Well, no, I'm sorry, I take that back. Not largely analytical, but in any case, largely abstract and not determined in any case by the physical world. Understanding, in distinction from pure reason or logic, is about the external world and experience. How do I understand the relationship between my releasing the pencil and the pencil falling? How do I understand that the tree is a unity, a single thing that has consistent existence? I don't get any of this from pure empirical data, right, as we learned from Hume. But also mathematics isn't going to help me with this. Right? Mathematics may give me the concept of a one, and it may allow me to do, some basic thinking a priori, arrive at certain a priori synthetic truths that can be applied to the experiential world. Right? Certainly, mathematical equations hold, are valid for the world of experience, but they don't in themselves explain the world of experience. And the understanding is that part of cognition that that explains, that understands the realm of experience. Now, this is the more, I think, revolutionary and perhaps challenging part of Kant's thinking here. Because many philosophers before Kant have argued that mathematics is ideal and is right, purely intellectual, non-empirical. That we have knowledge of mathematics without reference to the external world. That's not particularly new. What's more revolutionary for Kant is the idea that a priori synthetic judgments are not just mathematical, but also scientific. That a certain understanding about relations between things, scientific understanding about relations between things, is possible for us without reference to the external world. So he writes at the top of this second part, among the principles of this universal physics, right? So what will this science be? Right? This a priori science that furnishes the understanding with the ability to make sense of our empirical experience. Right? This science is going to be physics. Now, before I get into this quote, I want to flag, we already saw this a little bit through mathematics, right? That there are certain laws that govern space. There are certain laws that govern time. Those laws allow for mathematics. And those laws will also be the foundations of physics. What is physics? Except essentially the study of space and time. So space and time are a priori, are not attached to things in themselves. Then physics will be an a priori science, or as Kant says, partially a priori, dealing with the pure laws of space and time. Right? So he writes, among the principles of this universal physics, a few are found that actually have the universality we require, such as the proposition that substance remains and persists, that everything that happens always previously is determined by a cause according to constant laws. So, the two main examples of this pure physics that we have understanding of, or that exists a priori, are identity, the fact that a substance persists, that the tree is a tree, that a being is a being, that a one is a one. And the idea of causation, right? That everything that exists must have a cause. So we're running out of time. We'll get into the details of this more next week. But for now, we can think about the way that the nature of space and time themselves give rise to this a priori necessary understanding, necessary science that dictates the concept of identity and the concept of causation. Right? The fact that in space, a thing remains the same through time implies the concept of identity. You don't need reference to anything but pure space and pure time in order, therefore, to have the concept of identity. Same is roughly true of causation. You don't need reference to anything but pure time to understand that what is now, is only now by virtue of the fact that what was then is no longer. Right? That the fading of what was gives rise to what is, and that there is therefore in succession a kind of inherent concept of causation, right? In the sense of a beginning and an end and directionality. Right? Production of time already implies the concept of causation. So that these essential scientific concepts, which are the foundation of all understanding of the empirical world, are also themselves fundamentally non-empirical and based only in those pure intuitions of space and time. All right, so we'll leave it there for today, and we'll pick up with this problem of the natural sciences next Monday.